The silence of New York was a different creature altogether. It wasn't the deep, woolly quiet of the St. John's Wood Library where Eleanor Shipley had spent the last decade of her life, a silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of pages and the occasional, discreet clearing of a throat. This New York silence, in her small, overpriced apartment on the Upper West Side, was a tense, temporary thing. It was the held breath before the storm of a siren, the vacuum before a sudden, jarring shout from the street, or, as she was about to discover, the prelude to an auditory invasion of a most personal nature. Eleanor had arrived 3 days prior, a year-long cultural exchange librarian tasked with bringing a touch of British order to the bustling, slightly chaotic children's section of a prestigious New York public library. She had unpacked her few boxes with meticulous care, her collection of bone china teacups, her worn copy of 84 Charing Cross Road, her sensible tweed skirts, and her prized possession, a silver tea caddy filled with a formidable supply of Fortnum and Mason's Royal Blend. The apartment, though small, had charmed her with its high ceilings and, most importantly, a large window that opened onto a shared courtyard. It was a patch of coveted green, flanked by the backs of other brownstones, a secret garden in the heart of the concrete jungle, or so the rental listing had promised. It was on this fourth morning, a Saturday, that the peace was shattered. Eleanor was performing the sacred ritual of her morning tea. The kettle had just sung its boiling song. The tea was steeping in its pot under a cozy knitted in the image of the Queen's corgi, and she was about to pour the first, life-giving cup. Then it began. A torrent of sound exploded from the apartment directly opposite hers. It wasn't just music. It was an assault, a pounding, brash, electric guitar riff followed by a voice that seemed to be shouting, rather than singing about "livin' on a prayer." The bass line vibrated through the floorboards, making her teacup rattle on its saucer. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over the pot. This was barbaric. It was 8:17 on a Saturday morning, a sacred time, a time for quiet contemplation and caffeine. She strode to her window, peering through the lace curtains. The window opposite was wide open. Inside, she could see a man. He was shirtless, which she noted with a flicker of distaste, and he was dancing, or rather, he was air drumming with a terrifying, unbridled enthusiasm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with tousled, sun-streaked brown hair and a physique that suggested he spent more time in a gym than a library. Handsome in a loud, American sort of way. He was a human exclamation mark in a world where Eleanor preferred full stops. This would not do. Dignity, she believed, was the first line of defense against chaos. She finished pouring her tea, took a fortifying sip, and then marched to her own window. She did not shout. Shouting was for fishwives and football hooligans. Instead, she closed her window with a firm, deliberate, and resonant thud. The sound cut through the guitar solo like a punctuation error. The air drumming stopped. The man turned, his eyes squinting across the 20 feet of courtyard that separated them. He saw Eleanor, standing ramrod straight, her expression a masterpiece of polite, glacial disapproval. He gave a slow, uncomprehending blink, then shrugged, turned, and blessedly turned the music down, a fraction. It was a victory, but a shallow one. The war, Eleanor felt with a sinking certainty, had just begun. His name, she learned the following Tuesday, was Jack O'Donnell. She learned this because he was in the courtyard, bellowing it into his phone. O'Donnell. Jack O'Donnell. Yeah, the architect. Listen, the client wants to change the facade again? Tell them it's structural, for crying out loud. No, it's not, but it should be. Eleanor was trying to enjoy a rare hour of afternoon sun with a book of E.M. Forster. Jack's voice, a booming baritone that carried without effort, made it impossible to follow the subtle complexities of interpersonal relationships in Edwardian England. He was a force of nature, this Jack O'Donnell. His laughter was a sudden, explosive event. His conversations were public performances. He seemed to live his entire life at a volume Eleanor found physically taxing. Their feud escalated in a series of small, polite skirmishes, When Jack hosted a casual barbecue that spilled into the courtyard and lasted until 2 a.m., Eleanor responded not by calling the police, but by placing a pot of her most pungent, oversteeped Earl Grey outside her door, the malodorous cloud a silent protest against the smell of charred meat and cigar smoke. When Eleanor began practicing her morning yoga in the courtyard at 7 a.m., her serene poses and measured breathing a stark contrast to his boisterousness, Jack accidentally let his new, hyperactive golden retriever puppy, Buster, off its leash. Buster, seeing Eleanor's downward-facing dog as an invitation to play, had licked her face with an enthusiasm that left her sputtering and posed ruined. The final straw, however, was the great tea incident. Eleanor had received a care package from home. Inside, nestled in a bed of Excelsior, was a brand new, unopened tin of her favorite, and now tragically discontinued, Fortnum and Mason Diamond Jubilee blend. It was her treasure, her comfort, a taste of a world where things made sense. She placed it on her kitchen counter, a golden beacon of hope. That evening, Jack, in a fit of what he probably called neighborly goodwill, had decided to bake cookies. His baking, like everything else, was a chaotic affair involving more rock music and spilled flour than seemed strictly necessary. He ran out of sugar. Seeing Eleanor's light on, and remembering her with a vague sense of a prissy, tea-loving Englishwoman, he decided to be bold. He knocked. Eleanor, startled, opened the door a crack. "Yes." "Hey, neighbor." Jack from across the way. "I'm in a bind. Baking cookies. Out of sugar. Can I borrow a cup?" Eleanor, disarmed by the directness, nodded. One moment. She turned to her kitchen, but Jack, ever the invader, stepped just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning her immaculate space. "Wow, you're really tidy. It's like a museum in here." His gaze fell upon the beautiful royal blue tin. "Oh ha, kun tin. Is this sugar?" Before Eleanor could form the word no, his large, flour-dusted hand had snapped open the clasp and pried off the lid. He scooped a heaping cup of the precious, fragrant black leaves, mistaking them for some exotic brown sugar. "Thanks a million. You're a lifesaver," he boomed, already halfway back to his apartment, leaving Eleanor standing in her doorway, speechless with horror, holding an empty cup and a profound, soul-deep sense of violation. The next morning, a small, neatly wrapped package appeared on Jack's doormat. Inside was a single, pristine cookie, iced with the words, "I do not sugarcoat my words. That was my Diamond Jubilee tea." Attached was an itemized invoice, typed and utterly serious, for the cost of the tin, plus emotional damages and import anxiety, totaling a ludicrous £85 and 47 pence. Jack stared at it, then burst out laughing. This woman was insane, and, he had to admit, brilliantly petty. He showed the cookie to his friends that night, framing it as a hilarious story about his crazy British neighbor. But later, alone, he felt a prick of something unfamiliar, guilt. He hadn't meant to ruin her tea. He'd just been impulsive. It was how he lived his life. A week later, a package appeared on Eleanor's doorstep. It was a garishly colored box of something called Lipton Yellow Label Tea. Scrawled on a post-it note was, "A peace offering. The good stuff. Winky face." Eleanor looked at the box as if it were a dead rodent. Lipton. It was an insult, a declaration of war more profound than any noise complaint. She disposed of it with the reverence one might afford nuclear waste. The turning point, as turning points often are, was born not from conflict but from an external crisis. It was a Thursday, and a late nor'easter had descended on the city with unexpected fury. The wind howled, the rain fell in sheets, and the power flickered, then died entirely. Eleanor, who prided herself on preparedness, lit her emergency candles. She had her tea, of course, and a blanket, but the silence, now that the city's hum was gone, felt different. It was vast and empty. The wind rattled her windows, and a sudden, sharp crack followed by a crash from the courtyard made her jump. Peering out, She saw that a large, rotten branch from the central oak tree had sheared off, landing squarely across the courtyard, blocking both her and Jack's doorways. And huddled under the narrow eave of his doorway, shivering and soaked, was Buster the puppy. Jack was away. He'd mentioned it to her that morning, shouted off to Boston for a meeting, back tonight, that she had pointedly ignored. The puppy was alone, terrified in the storm. All of Eleanor's resentment melted away in an instant, replaced by a surge of pure, practical compassion. This was not about feud or manners. This was about a living creature. Grabbing her umbrella and a thick towel, she waded out into the storm. The branch was an obstacle, but she managed to clamber over it, her dignity be damned. "Come here, you silly creature," she said, her voice soft. Buster, recognizing a friendly tone, whined and scrambled into her arms. She bundled him in the towel and carried him, a wriggling, wet mass of gratitude, back into her apartment. She dried him off, gave him a bowl of water, and let him curl up on her sofa, where he promptly fell asleep, his head in her lap. When Jack arrived home hours later, his flight delayed and his taxi struggling through the storm-battered streets, his heart was in his throat. He'd been worried about Buster. Pushing his way past the fallen branch, he saw his dark, cold apartment and his stomach dropped. Then he saw a sliver of candlelight from Eleanor's window. And there, curled up on her sofa, fast asleep with the prim Englishwoman gently stroking his head, was his dog. Jack stood in the rain for a full minute, just watching. The scene was so contrary to everything he believed about his neighbor, the ice queen of the courtyard, that his brain struggled to process it. Her stern features were softened in the candlelight, her posture relaxed as she read a book with her free hand. She looked kind. He knocked softly. Eleanor started, then carefully extricated herself from the sleeping puppy and came to the door. She opened it, her expression wary. "Jack." "Eleanor." He gestured weakly towards the sofa. I see you've met Buster." "He was distressed by the storm," she said simply. It seemed the proper thing to do. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate. They were stripped of his usual bravado. I was really worried. The power's out, and the branch." He trailed off, looking genuinely vulnerable for the first time since she'd met him. "Yes, well, it appears we are both trapped until someone can clear it. Would you?" She paused, the invitation clearly causing her physical pain. "Would you like to come in? I have a candle, and tea. Proper one." It was the most magnanimous sentence she had ever uttered to him. And so Jack O'Donnell found himself sitting in Eleanor Shipley's impeccably ordered apartment, drinking a cup of the most astonishingly good tea he had ever tasted, while his dog snored at his feet. The conversation was stilted at first. "So, you're an architect," Eleanor said, for lack of anything else. "Yep, mostly high-end residential. It's a lot of managing insane demands and bigger egos. I'm a librarian. We generally have to manage only the occasional overdue book." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Jack stared. She had a smile, transformed her entire face. He told her about growing up in a loud, loving Irish-Italian family in New Jersey, about the pressure to be the successful one, the one who made it in the city. She told him, in her careful, precise way, about the quiet village in Cornwall where she was raised, about her love for stories that were tidy and made sense, unlike life. They talked for 2 hours. He learned that her primness was a shield for a dry, wicked wit. She learned that his loudness was a performance to mask a deep-seated fear of not being enough. He wasn't just loud, he was passionate. She wasn't just quiet, she was observant. When the power finally surged back on, the sudden electric light felt like an intrusion. Jack stood reluctantly. "I should get this guy home. And, Eleanor, thank you. Seriously. For Buster. And the tea." "You are welcome, Jack." He paused at the door, now cleared by a building superintendent with a chainsaw. "Hey, maybe Maybe the noise won't be so bad from now on. I should hope not, she said, but the sting was gone from her words. The courtyard, in the weeks that followed, became a different place. It was no longer a battleground but a neutral territory, and then, tentatively, a shared space. Jack did, in fact, keep the noise down. The 8 a.m. rock concerts ceased. In their place, Eleanor would sometimes hear the faint, sophisticated strains of jazz floating from his window. It was a concession she appreciated deeply. One Saturday, she found him struggling to contain an exuberant buster in the courtyard. "He needs proper exercise," she stated. "Not just this postage stamp of grass." "Oh, you have a better idea?" Jack asked, grinning. "I do, as a matter of fact." And that was how Jack O'Donnell found himself on a brisk, educational walk through Central Park with Eleanor Shipley, who pointed out the architectural history of the Bethesda Terrace and the literary significance of the Bow Bridge. He listened, genuinely fascinated. He saw the city through her eyes, and it became richer, more layered. In return, he dragged her to a Yankees game. She went under protest, wearing a look of profound suffering, but by the seventh-inning stretch, she was asking nuanced questions about the rules and, to her own astonishment, cheering politely for a well-executed double play. He introduced her to the greasy, glorious perfection of a proper New York slice. She introduced him to the sublime experience of a perfectly brewed cup of tea with scones and clotted cream, a meal he had previously associated with his great Aunt Bridget. The friction didn't entirely disappear. It transformed. Their debates over the merits of cricket versus baseball, or the proper way to make a cup of tea, he was a chronic oversteeper, were spirited but now filled with a warm, teasing respect. They were no longer feuding neighbors. They were becoming friends. And then, one balmy spring evening, as they shared a bottle of wine in the courtyard, the dynamic shifted again. Buster was asleep at their feet. The fairy lights Jack had strung up were twinkling, and a comfortable silence had fallen between them. "You know," Jack said, his voice softer than usual, "I used to think you were the most uptight, judgmental person I'd ever met." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And I thought you were a barbarian with the auditory sensitivity of a concussed warthog." He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that she realized she had come to enjoy. "And now," she said, looking at him thoughtfully in the dim light, "I think you are unexpectedly thoughtful, and you have excellent taste in dogs." High praise. His smile faded into something more serious. He leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "Eleanor, this year, it's been the best one I've had in a long time." Her breath caught. The air, which had been filled with the scent of jasmine and city, suddenly felt charged. The space between them seemed to shrink. She could see the gold flecks in his green eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw. The handsome, loud American was no longer an adversary, but a man she had come to admire, to care for. "Jack, she began, but the words failed her. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture that conveyed more than any sentence could. He moved closer, his hand reaching to gently cup her cheek. It was a question, and her answer was to close the remaining distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was tender, tentative, and utterly, wonderfully life-altering. The final month of Eleanor's stay passed in a bittersweet blur. What had begun as a feud, matured into a friendship, and blossomed into a romance, now faced the immutable deadline of her visa. Their time together was intensified, every shared morning coffee, every quiet evening in the courtyard, every exploration of the city, tinged with the knowledge of its imminent end. They spoke of it in careful, circumspect terms. "You could stay," Jack said one night, his head in her lap as they listened to a record in his pharmacie but now familiar apartment. "It's not that simple," Eleanor replied, her fingers tracing patterns in his hair. "My job, my life, it's in London." "I know," he sighed. "My life is here. My firm, it's finally taking off." They were two mature adults with established lives, separated by an ocean. The fairy tale of the courtyard seemed destined to remain just that, a one-year story. The day of her departure was overcast, the sky a dull, mournful gray. Jack helped her pack her final boxes, his usual boisterous energy subdued. The bone china teacups were wrapped with a care that bordered on reverence. The courtyard, their courtyard, stood empty and quiet. A taxi idled at the curb. It was time. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice tight. She was wearing a crisp, travel-appropriate dress, every inch the composed librarian, but her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Don't forget this," Jack said, handing her a carefully wrapped package. She opened it. Inside was a beautiful, custom-made silver tea infuser and a year's supply of Fortnum and Mason Royal Blend.
A real, proper replaçament.
And tucked inside the box was a photograph of the two of them with Buster, laughing in the courtyard. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, her composure cracking. He pulled her into a fierce, tight embrace. "I love you, you infuriating, wonderful woman. I love you too, you impossible, loud American," she choked out, burying her face in his shoulder. They kissed, a desperate, hopeful, heartbreaking kiss. Then, with a final, lingering look, Eleanor got into the taxi. She didn't look back as it pulled away. She couldn't. Jack stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the silence of the courtyard at his back feeling deeper and more profound than ever before. 6 months later. The new library in St. John's Wood was a beautiful, modern addition to the old building, all glass and light. Eleanor Shipley, head librarian now, moved through the familiar quiet with a sense of purpose that was, nonetheless, shadowed by a quiet ache. London had welcomed her back. Her life was ordered, sensible, and exactly as she had left it, and she felt the loss of the chaos every single day. Her assistant approached her desk. "A parcel for you, Miss Shipley." Rather large. It was a flat, rectangular crate. Puzzled, she opened it. Inside, protected by layers of bubble wrap, was an architectural rendering. It was a beautifully detailed drawing of a building, but not just any building. It was a library, and in the foreground, rendered in minute detail, was a courtyard. And in that courtyard were two tiny figures, a man with a dog and a woman holding a book. Taped to the front was a business card. Jack O'Donnell, architect. O'Donnell and Shipley, transatlantic design. New York and London. And scrawled on the back in his familiar, messy hand was, "The client insists on a shared courtyard, and she's a very demanding client. I have a 1-year visa. Let's negotiate the noise levels. And the tea. I love you." Eleanor stared at the drawing, at the two tiny figures in their shared space, and a laugh bubbled up through her tears. It was not a tidy ending. It was messy and complicated, and involved oceans and visas and a terrifying leap of faith. It was not the end of a story, but the chaotic, beautiful, unpredictable beginning of a new one. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Shipley couldn't wait to turn the page.